Another shocking terrorist attack on free speech, by the way, in France. A teacher in Paris told his class he wanted to teach them the importance of free speech, even when it came to cartoons of Muhammad. But to start with, he said, could any Muslim students here who might be offended leave the room? Don't want to shock you. Some did, one didn't. The teacher then showed the class a cartoon of Muhammad. One family complained, the word got out, and an 18-year-old refugee from Chechnya, a Muslim guy, last week went to the school, asked students to point out the teacher and cut off his head. Posted a picture on Twitter of the head and left the body lying in the street. Horrible, horrible. Now make no mistake, the killer shouted Allahu Akbar. That was his agenda and was later shot dead by police. There have been huge rallies in France to honour the teacher and to defend free speech. French President Emmanuel Macron did the same.
Je ne parlerai pas des détails de ce qui s'est passé ce soir à Conflans, mais un de nos concitoyens a été assassiné aujourd'hui parce qu'il enseignait, parce qu'il apprenait à des élèves la liberté d'expression, la liberté de croire et de ne pas croire.
Now, not everyone has joined in that condemnation of the murder and the celebration of or defence of free speech. In Britain, an occasional writer for the left-wing New Statesman, an Iraqi Kurd, said, I fully condemn French police's brutal, senseless murder of the Muslim suspect last night. Macron and his security apparatus should explain to the public what was the need for the use of the disproportionate force against someone suspected of a knife crime. Dear God. Anyway, France has been here before, of course, suffering for the free speech, which seems so central to French identity as, well, the identity that we used to imagine, I guess. Last month, an important trial started, a trial of 15 suspected terrorists behind the shocking attacks 5 years ago on staff of Charlie Hebdo, a satirical newspaper, and also on a Jewish kosher market. 17 people were murdered then, including journalists and cartoonists whose sin, according to the terrorists, was also drawing cartoons of Muhammad. And those on trial are accused of financing or otherwise helping them. Now, because of that trial, another Muslim refugee, this one from Pakistan, stabbed 2 people in Paris, thank God, not fatally. Again, he had support, this time from his father, who said he was proud.
He killed the blasphemer of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The person who kills those who blaspheme the Prophet goes to heaven, and his whole family goes to heaven. Therefore, I feel very good that my son did such a good deed.
Now, there are clearly several issues here, well, big ones. I'm sure there are many more. First, is the West still prepared to defend free speech, which is so central, of course, to the West becoming the great intellectual force, the great scientific and intellectual culture of the past 600 years. Then there's this. Is free speech even possible now in societies like France with huge Islamic minorities? Is it possible without people being killed? President Macron says it must be, but earlier this year, when a teenage lesbian responded to homophobic abuse by Muslims on social media by saying Islam was a religion of hate, she got so many more threats that she had to go into hiding. And worse, police investigated her for her supposed hate crimes. And then there's the last big question of the 3. Can Islam be reformed? Wouldn't that be easier? And if that's going to happen, what do we do about Islamic leaders like Pakistan President Imran Khan? You might remember Khan as once the playboy of the West, admired here in Australia as a great cricketer and a team captain, but since then he's buried himself in Islam, and as President of Pakistan told the United Nations 2 weeks ago that the West was picking on Muslims and blaspheming by drawing pictures of Muhammad, and this had to be stopped.
Muslims continue to be targeted with impunity in many countries. Our shrines are being destroyed. Our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam insulted. The Holy Quran burnt. And all this in the name of freedom of speech. Incidents in Europe, including republication of blasphemous sketches by Charlie Hebdo are recent examples. We stress that willful provocations and incitement to hate and violence must be universally outlawed.
Joining me is Brendan ONeill, editor of the online magazine Spiked, a brilliant campaigner for free speech, who's also written extensively on the threats to it. Brendan ONeill, thank you so much for joining me. First of all, how do we treat this? Is it just, here's just one isolated, disturbed young man committing a barbaric crime, or is this a symbol of a wider clash?
This is definitely a symbol of a wider clash. This brutal beheading, this medieval execution, which is what it essentially was, it didn't take place in a vacuum. It took place in a world, in a continent, Europe, where firstly, radical Islam is on the rise. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been slaughtered by radical Islamists in Europe over the past 5 years. And secondly, it took place on a continent where we are constantly told that it is wicked and wrong to criticize Islam, where mainstream institutions, the woke elites, the cultural elites are always telling us that it's bad to criticize Islam, it's punching down to criticize Islam, it's Islamophobic to question any aspect of that religion. These are mainstream ideas coming from the woke elites. And I think what we need to realize is that the woke elites share something very important in common with radical Islamists, including the murderer of this school teacher, which is the idea that criticism of Islam can be punished, whether by people being no-platformed, sacked, or, in this extreme case, killed. We have got to normalize criticism of Islam as part of freedom of speech.
Yeah, well, that's easy to say. Just note, by the way, that Imran Khan's Pakistan has just been voted onto the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, so I don't think they'll be defending the human right of free speech there terribly well. Now, the reaction to this murder, on the one hand, you've got the protests defending free speech. On the other hand, you've got people like that New Statesman writer condemning the French police for shooting the killer. Do you take comfort from the reaction, or do you worry?
I take comfort from the huge rallies in France. I think they were very uplifting. People in France and people in many countries obviously care about freedom of speech. They care about the right of teachers and others to express ideas and to encourage critical thinking. But I'm worried, deeply worried by the reaction more broadly. And it's not only that there are some crazy, cranky people who are criticizing the French police for killing this Islamic executioner, but also more broader than that, there's been a lack of response. Here in the UK, very few teaching unions have expressed solidarity with the people of France. If they have, they've done it in a very perfunctory way. And we're right next door to France. France is 25 miles away from us. This is a terrible, graphic murder of someone for speaking freely. And it has not caused a huge fuss here in the UK or in other European countries. So the part of the response that worries me most is the kind of thing that happens after every Islamic attack, actually, which is this idea that we shouldn't dwell on it too much. We should forget about it. Don't look back in anger, which was the slogan after the Manchester Arena atrocity in 2017. We're always discouraged from talking too much or getting too angry about these attacks, and we're told to move on. I think that's already happening in relation to this beheading, and that worries me enormously.
Well, that's correct. I mean, the criticism of Islam and these attacks then is characterised as pathologised as Islamophobia, and you become the problem. You become the issue. Your reaction to the atrocities is the problem, not the atrocities themselves. I think it's just sick. Now, Macron a couple of weeks ago said that Islam was in crisis. He unveiled a plan to tackle Islamic separation or separatism. Some of his plans seemed okay, Brendan. I mean, checking foreign funding of French mosques, making imams get a government certificate to preach, maybe, I don't know, banning homeschooling so kids couldn't be withdrawn from mainstream schooling. But some of it, I didn't quite get it. Making Arabic language a priority in schools, a fund to promote Islamic culture, these seem concessions. What do you make of it all?
Yeah, I think it was rather contradictory. I think you're right. Some of the suggestions were pretty good, and I was quite surprised that they came from President Macron, who is not the best president France has ever had. But the on the other hand, he had this idea of promoting Islamic culture, this kind of slightly apologetic approach, which said, well, we still have to respect Islam and promote Islam, which I just think is wrong. And I think the broader problem in Western Europe in particular is simply the unwillingness of the intellectual elites and the political elites to stand up for freedom of speech, to say to all people who come to this country or who are born from immigrant communities, to say to them, listen, we have particular values, the most important of which is freedom and tolerance, and you have to subscribe to those values, and that's what makes a good society. It's the unwillingness of our kind of illiberal, relativistic elites to make those kinds of arguments, which I think often acts as a green light to separatism, to ethnic division, and even to radical Islam. So we really have to get our own house in order and explain to people very clearly that we stand by freedom, and if you don't stand by freedom, then we've got a problem with you.
There have been some incremental steps on that route, I must say. You know, I noticed that one of the German higher courts has upheld a decision to strip an immigrant, a Muslim immigrant, of his citizenship certificate when he refused to shake the hand of the woman who was handing it to him. So she said, all right, you can't be a citizen if that's the case. The role of Imran Khan. This is a man who has Australian business leaders like mining tycoon Andrew Forrest playing court to him, sports fans still thinking he's great. But he's kind of preaching against free speech and that painting of Muslims as the victims of the West instead of a challenge perhaps to them. Strikes me as dangerous. How should we counter this, particularly when the guy's country has just been handed a position in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations?
I thought Imran Khan's comments were incredibly dangerous and very, very provocative. And he was essentially saying that it is wicked and cruel and wrong to criticize Islam, and it should be banned across the world. That's what he's arguing for, which I think is going to whip up more radical Islamist fury with anyone like Charlie Hebdo who mocks Muhammad or criticizes Islam or makes fun of Islam. I thought his comments were incendiary. And the way we challenge this, it sounds straightforward, but as you say, it's very, very difficult. We have to make the case for freedom of speech all the time. And that means the freedom to mock all gods, prophets, ideologies and fads. Everything should be up for debate, and that includes Islam. And I think everyone in the West would benefit if we made this argument that freedom of speech applies to everyone equally. Muslim communities would benefit from it too, and so would people more broadly. No idea, no religion, no prophet should be beyond questioning, comedy and debate.
I know. But Brendan, of course, you know, you've got to make a stand for free speech in other areas too, from the woke crowd, etc. Unless otherwise you look like a hypocrite. Brendan ONeill, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you.